Go ahead and find your seats, class. We'll begin in just a minute. We'll begin in about 60 seconds. All right, class, welcome back. We'd like to begin promptly to honor our guest speakers. And Sean, you give me the signal when I can make an announce, or when I can announce our speakers. Welcome back to the World Christianity Project. We're delighted to have you with us today, and also it is our special honor to have with us Dr. Kevin Xiwi-Yeo. Dr. Kevin Xiwi-Yeo will be giving us the main lecture today. He is Associate Professor of World Christianity and Asian Studies at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. In 2003, he was appointed Assistant Professor at the Department of Theological Studies at the China Graduate School of Theology, located in Hong Kong. In 1987, Dr. Yeo began work at the Institute of World Religions, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, as an editor and researcher. He was with the Institute for 2 years and also served as a visiting scholar there. During his tenure at China Graduate School of Theology, he was a researcher at the school's Chinese Culture Research Center, where he participated in numerous academic conferences and other events and contributed significantly to Christian scholarship in Hong Kong and mainland China. In recent years, he has also become active in scholarly exchanges among Korean, Japanese, and Chinese church historians. He belongs to the American Academy of Religion and the American Society of Missiology. Dr. Yeo's research interests include the fundamentalist and evangelical movements in China and in America, comparative studies of Christianities in China, Korea, and Japan, the history of Christian pacifism in China, Chinese traditional religions and culture, and their relation to Christianity and Christian thought in contemporary China. He has published widely in English and in Chinese. Dr. Yeo, we're very, very glad to have you with us today. Also honoring us by their presence are panel members, Dr. Timothy Sisk. Dr. Timothy Sisk is Professor of Intercultural Studies and Chair of the Missions Department at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. Dr. Sisk served for a number of years as a missionary in Japan and also in Bolivia. A frequent conference speaker and missions advocate, Dr. Sisk also serves as a board member for Evangelical Baptist Missionaries. Dr. Sisk is co-editor of Reaching the City, Reflections on Urban Mission for the 21st Century. Dr. Sisk, thank you so much for joining us today. Also, we're delighted to have in from Italy, although she usually teaches in the States, Dr. Catherine Weigel, sociocultural and anthropologist, whose current research interests include new religious movements and religious change, mass media and religion, global, urban, and popular culture, and colonialism. Dr. Weigel's book, El Shaddai, A Contemporary Mass Religious Movement in the Philippines, won a 2007 National Book Award in the Philippines, given by the Manila Critic Circle and the National Book Development Board. She has worked on various U.S. State Department leadership training programs for Filipino and Southeast Asia youth culture and, strike that, we'll have to cut that in the edit. She has worked on various U.S. State Department leadership training programs for Filipino and Southeast Asia youth and adults. Currently, Dr. Weigel is part of a working group organized by Boston University's Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs entitled Markets, Democracy and Miracles, Evangelicalism and Charismatic Christians in the Second and Third Generation. She is also contributing to Regent University's Symposium, Pentecostalism and Prosperity, the Socioeconomics of Global Renewal. Dr. Weigel, thank you so much for being with us as well. Round of applause, please.
Thank you.
And for us, you may begin at any time.
Okay. It's an honor to speak to you today. The topic I want to share with you this morning is the morning here is a fundamentalist past and the current theologizing of Chinese church. I think most of you are familiar with the story of the Chinese church to a certain degree. So my presentation probably not going to too much details. I just want to sketch the development of the Chinese Christianity, especially the Protestant stories since the 1980s. That's going to be my focus. Let me begin. Since the 1980s, among all religions in China, Protestantism has been the fastest growing one for the last several decades. Actually, I'm sorry, we should be on the next slide. Well, it was said that throughout the 1990s, average 1 million new members were added to the Protestant community each year. Today, you can find in China one of the largest Protestant communities among the world. So we're talking about 50 to 100 million believers. Even though their percentage in the general population is still not very high. The Chinese church began to make an impact on the global stage. In the recent years, and they began to talk about sending out a large number of missionaries to overseas. So it's not going to be a surprise to find the Chinese missionaries probably in your neighborhood, at your doorstep, in the years to come. So to highlight that coming impact from the Chinese church, I published and wrote and published an article and essay entitled "The Chinese Church's Next Superpower in World Mission." Is listed on my PowerPoint slides, if you can see that. It's published on Evangelical Mission Quarterly on the July issue of this year. So before I move on, I would like to make it clear that I should limit my discussion today to the Protestant community in mainland China. Well, theologically and historically speaking, the Chinese church today is certainly a child of the fundamentalist and revival movement of 1920s and 30s. And therefore, I believe in order to understand Chinese church today, and we really have to trace its history. Now we are moving to the next slide, the 19th century. Robert Morrison's arrival in 1807 is remembered as the starting point of Protestant missionary movement in China. Generally speaking, the 19th century was a era of great missionary expansion and church planting in the midst of continuous tensions between the traditional elements in the Chinese society and the Christian community. It was no doubt the Western missionaries who played the leading role in the Christian movement in the country of the 19th century. Throughout the 19th century, China missionaries were remarkably unified in their doctrinal outlook. Their understanding of mission and church and their mission strategy and methods are remarkably unified. So as James Allen Patterson points out, and there existed across the world, actually at that time, a so-called Protestant missionary consensus. What is a consensus all about? And he pointed out to 4 aspects. The number 1 was evangelism and church planting as the priority of the mission. Secondly, the doctrinal allegiance to the uniquely divine nature of Christ is confirmed. Thirdly, the willingness to define the social dimension of the mission was certainly also highlighted in the missionary thinkings of the 19th centuries. Fourthly, pragmatic ecumenism or cooperative mission efforts was very common in the 19th centuries. So this consensus indeed reflected the theological orientation and ethos of the evangelical unities in the Great Britain and North America of 19th centuries. So through those missionaries, those evangelical theology and ethos came to China and shaped the emerging native church. But the number of the Protestant missionaries was still quite small in the 19th century. And the native church's leadership abilities and independence was still lacking or weak, even though the Chinese Christian community experienced significant growth in the 19th century. Now we move to the next slide. The first half of the 20th centuries. Early 20th centuries was a crucial period for Christianity in China. In the wake of the Boxer rebellions in the 1900s, social environment turned quite favorable to the new ideas from the West and from the Christianity. In contrast to the previous century, the most significant change was perhaps the maturity and the rise of the Chinese church. The church grew not only in quantity, but also in quality. And the generations of the Chinese church leaders, trained either domestically or abroad, began to take leadership roles in churches or church-related institutions and prove their capabilities to lead the church independently and effectively. Even more dramatic were the revival movements, led by the Chinese evangelists that swept the country like a wildfire. Indeed, the days of missionary dominations in the Chinese church were definitely gone. Early 20th centuries was also a time of unprecedented diversification and divisions within the Protestant missionary community and church in China. Through publication, guest speakers, and the arrival of large number of young missionaries, liberal theologies and social gospels quickly became a powerful voice within the missionary circles and within the Chinese church. The growing diversification increasingly challenged the Christian unities and so-called the Protestant missionary consensus in China. And the modernist fundamentalist controversy finally shattered so-called Protestant missionary consensus in the 1920s. The missionary body in China was deeply polarized. Within the Chinese church, the fundamentalist modernist conflict was never as intense as among the foreign missionaries, but the differences were real and deep. Relatively few in number, liberals in the Chinese church were largely elites and held key positions in such institutions as the Christian colleges, the National Christian Councils, and the YMCA. And they even played the role of church spokesperson to the general public. Optimistic about the history and society and critical of the traditional evangelical mission model, they put the social involvement and evangelism on equal footing and made consistent efforts to highlight Christian relevance to the nationalist and socialist movement, which was very popular in China in early 20th centuries. And they also played the leading roles in relating Christian faith to Chinese traditional and modern culture. In the meantime, there existed a silent majority, including many grassroots urban and rural congregations within the mission-related church structures, as well as independent evangelical churches, deeply shaped by the missionary movement of 19th centuries. Most of those Chinese churches were theologically quite conservative, and their teaching turned to be simple and biblical. And their ministries single-mindedly centered on spreading the gospels and saving souls. By the 1920s, the overall conservative tendencies of most churches were further reinforced and sharpened by the rise of indigenous evangelical churches and revival movement. Some of the most prominent evangelical church groups and revival groups were the Assembly Hall or Little Flock, Jesus Family, the True Jesus Church, the Spiritual Gifts Movement, and Bethel Mission. And those years also witnessed unprecedented waves of interdenominational evangelical and revival movement initiated or led and by individual Chinese church leaders. From those movements indeed emerged a generation of charismatic and influential Chinese evangelists and revivalists, such as Wang Mingdao, Watchman Nee, Zhang Song, Andrew Ji, and Wang Zai, and Marcus Chen. And theologically, and those groups and individuals have been shaped and influenced by various traditions, such as holiness, reform traditions, and premillennialism, and the Pentecostal teachings. But they also have a lot in common. They were all staunch believers in infallible biblical authorities and supernatural Christology, and emphasize soul-saving evangelism instead of social and cultural involvement. In those decades, and they were sometimes referred to as evangelicals, fundamentalists, or conservatives. In other words, those terms were largely interchangeable in those years. Furthermore, and those church leaders were all hostile to the liberal theology and liberal winds within the church. Someone like Wang Mingdao was vocal and persistent in attacking and criticizing the modernism throughout his own career, and never hesitated to denounce the liberals as false teachers or false prophets. What was upsetting for the Chinese evangelical was not only liberals' alleged denial and distortion of biblical teaching, but also their attempt to shift the missionary focus from evangelism to social service and cultural witness. In the Chinese evangelicals' mind, social gospel and modernism were simply two sides of the same coin, and unbiblical and heretical beyond doubt. Consequently, to differentiate themselves from the liberals, they put almost exclusive emphasis on evangelism at the cost of any social involvement. Shunning any social or political issues or apolitical attitude became characteristics of emerging Christian evangelical movement of the 1920s and 30s. For most of the fundamentalist church leaders, the liberals within the Chinese church made a lot of the unacceptable theological compromises in indigenizing the gospels in Chinese cultures. So therefore, they largely avoid the liberal enterprise of so-called indigenization. But that does not mean their theology and ministry were not shaped by the Chinese culture. In fact, one can argue the way of their theologizing is obviously very Chinese. For instance, the evangelical church leader revelries overwhelming emphasis on the imitation of Christ and the personal holiness or the moral character very much resemble the Confucian ideas of saints or the gentleman or 君子. Given their lack of strong and consistent interest in society and culture, understandably, the Chinese evangelicals' contribution to the growth and character formation of the Chinese church was far greater and much more significant than their liberal counterparts. Even till today, we can still see that most of the Chinese Protestant church or community across the world are evangelical, and the liberal influence among them and can be neglected. After the anti-Japanese War, which lasted from 1937 to 1945, when the war was over, the polarization within the Chinese Protestant church persisted. Evangelical theology in the church held on. Now we move to next slide. The second half of the 20th centuries. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the polarization within the Protestant church in mainland China was further complicated by the intervention of political forces. The emerging powerful Three Self-patriotic movement was increasingly dominated by such liberal figures as Y.T. Wu. While evangelical leaders either confronted TSPM, which is a Three Self-patriotic movement. I will refer to that movement as TSPM from now on. So the evangelical leaders either confronted TSPM from the very beginning or were marginalized or expelled from the movement. During the same period, mainland China went through the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution, and which started in 1966 and ended in 1976. And religious life was completely suppressed for most of those years. It was not until the late 1970s and early 1980s when the Chinese Communist Party and the government restored their religious policy and the correspondent controlling structure. Consequently, the TSPM was also revived, and the new China Christian Council founded. For the past 3 decades, the church under the TSPM structure has experienced steady and considerable growth. Indeed, just as in the 1950s, almost all the church leaders and theologians with liberal theological views can still be found only in TSPM, while the liberals were much less vocal. And the majority of the congregation associated with the TSPM are actually still very loyal to the evangelical and fundamentalist traditions and heritage, and formed actually before 1949, when the communists took over and established their rule in Beijing. However, for the past 3 decades also, the growth of the house church in China is even more impressive. In the 1980s, most of the house churches were founded in the rural areas and largely consisted of marginal social groups, such as the peasants, the elderly, women, and poorly educated, and in no position to challenge TSPM churches in size and social status. But in the 1990s, the spread of the house church movement in the urban areas has dramatically changed the landscape of the Protestantism in China. The newly rising house church in China urban areas share the overall theological outlook with the churches of the 1980s. In their loyalty to the biblical authority, emphasis on personal spiritual growth, and enthusiasm for mission, they demonstrate they are also the genuine inheritors of the Chinese evangelical heritage. In the meantime, it cannot be denied that some of those churches have some very significant new features. In addition to new sensitivities toward intellectual life and openness to theological education, a strong social and cultural concern definitely makes them distinctive from the old generations and churches of 1980s. A process similar to what happened to the overseas Chinese churches has finally started in the churches in the mainland China, a critical reflection on their own tradition and a deliberate identification with such international evangelical movement as the Lausanne movement. As a result, the dominance of old attitude toward culture, society, and politics has been giving way to a diversification of stance over those issues. So in other words, the traditional apolitical attitude were giving way to a sort of emerging political activism. Now let's move to the next slide and last slide, the current dynamics and the future trends. Examining the current theological scene of the Chinese church today, we can conclude that the majority of the churches are holding on to their own evangelical heritage, but at least a great number of the urban churches are eager to learn from the global church, especially from the church in the West. And there have been only some very sporadic, genuine attempts to construct a contextualized theology relevant to Chinese culture and context. More attempts are being made, but not yet bear any significant fruits. I'm talking about theological thinking and theological construction of the Chinese church in the 21st century. So I believe this is probably the fair estimate of current status of Chinese churches theologizing. After 3 decades of tremendous growth, the church in China is at a critical juncture. Among all the challenges facing the church, theological construction is especially difficult. However, it's very crucial. But still largely importing the theology from the West, the church in China, I believe, still has a long way to go before it can claim a genuine theology grounded in God's word, nourished by its own ecclesial tradition and Chinese culture, addressing the social and cultural issues and needs, and communicating with the global church. Ignoring the church's own theological heritage, disinterested in China's cultural traditions, and simply parroting fashionable Western theological discourses have actually reinforced the Western image of Christianity in China. Unfortunately, that's still the reality when you come to the theologizing in China today. Internally, the theological divisions, controversies, and denominationalism from the West have been uncritically introduced into the church in China today. As a result, the Christian unity and theological consensus have been damaged. Well, no doubt, to construct a viable and generally Chinese theology is an urgent task. Well, in my own opinion, such a theology must demonstrate the following characteristics. First, a viable Chinese theology must be firmly grounded in the biblical truths. Inherit and honor the evangelical tradition of the Chinese church itself, which is in the blood of most congregations in China. Especially important is the need to have this tradition renewed and updated so that it will stay relevant in the social and the cultural context today. Thirdly, the non-denominational quality of the Chinese evangelical tradition should be preserved under the precondition of biblical fidelity. A spirit of tolerance and open-mindedness should be promoted. The Chinese church and its theology should be nourished from multiple traditions, or not just by one or two denominational traditions. Fourthly, theologizing must be the business of the church, serving the church's needs. Otherwise, theology becomes a useless and purposeless fantasy, intellectual fantasy, and this is actually what happened in China today. And lots of the theology are constructed in the Chinese academics, and not so much effort are being made by the church, by the Christian communities. And so I think in order to construct relevant and viable theology, and which is significant to the church, which is helpful to the church, you really have to have the Christian community, Christian church, to start working on their own theological issues. Fifthly, it must be incarnated. I mean, the theology, the Chinese, genuine Chinese theology must be incarnated in the Chinese culture and social context. For the church, they should be a matter of life and death. The church needs to address concretely such issues as proclaiming the gospel in Chinese way and being a Christian as well as a patriot, a Chinese patriot. I think that one of the danger and challenge we have in terms of the Christian theologizing in China today is that we import way too much from the West, and we never make serious efforts to develop the Chinese theology based on God's words, and also shaped by the Chinese culture and shaped by the Chinese social context. And that's an urgent thing we need to do in the future. And sixthly, it must be global minded. A Chinese theology for the future must be globally minded. With all its Chinese flavors and characters, it should be open, loving, and humble toward the churches in the global north as well global south, willing to share the theological insights with each other for the purpose of mutual enrichment. Well, as a global partners of our Chinese brothers and sisters, I think we would be most helpful to them through our prayers and humble dialogues with them. And we would be most harmful in our attempts to impose our own theological views and denominational agendas on them. Let us engage them as our equal partners, respect their own decisions, and trust God's leadings and guidance in China today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yeo, for your very fine lecture. Very much appreciate that. Let's just quickly do a sound check again to make sure that everybody can hear everybody. Doctor, you hear us okay?
I didn't hear the name. Yeah,
And apparently you can hear us too. Can you confirm that you can hear us okay?
This is Tim.
Yeah.
This is Tim Sisk. Yes, I can hear you.
And we're all together. I'm going to read your titles again, just so that we're oriented, and then we'll get going with this discussion. Our thanks go again to Dr. Kevin Xiui Yao for that fascinating lecture. Dr. Yao is Associate Professor of World Christianity and Asian Studies at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And we're delighted to have with us Dr. Timothy Sisk, Chair of Professor of World Missions and Evangelism at Moody Bible Institute, and Dr. Catherine Weigel, Adjunct Assistant Professor at Northern Illinois University and Sociocultural Anthropologist. Thank you. Dr. Weigel or Dr. Sisk, do either of you two care to respond first to Dr. Yao?
Go ahead, Dr. White.
Well, thank you for the very interesting lecture. And I guess being an anthropologist, my perspective is going to be slightly different on this panel. And I work in the Philippines primarily and Southeast Asia. And so my knowledge of the history of the church in China is not as much, obviously. So as I was listening to you, I mainly questions arose for me as opposed to comments. But I guess knowing that part of your perspective is the tension between maintaining integrity in the theology and adapting to the social context and the current social issues and political context, what would you say is the most relevant social and political issues today in China as far as social change that might be offer kind of a push and pull with the biblical integrity that you're talking about?
Should I respond now, or?
The opportunity to respond right now. Thank you.
Okay. I would say for the church, for the Christian community as a whole, I would say the church need to pay attention to issues such as social equality and create, obviously, there is huge problems created by the economic takeoff in the past decades, and the widening gap between the poor and the rich. I would say that's probably the #1 social issues. Of course, there are other issues such as human rights and also the rights issues. But this is the tricky thing in the Chinese context. I think the church need to address need to make a distinction between what social and the political issue they really need to care about, and what are some of the inappropriate issues, and they should stay away from. I think that's really tricky issues and controversial issues. But I don't believe that the church, there are so many political and social issues that China face and the country face. But I don't believe the church needs to address all of them. But church need to address those fundamental issues which affected each member in the societies. The largest audience that need church's voice, such as the issue as a widening gap between poor and social justice issues and social equality issues. I think that's probably one of the issues. The issue like that, again, the human rights and the religious freedom issues. That sounds very basic issues for the social group in the West. But again, in the Chinese context, I think the church should be very careful about that issues, because in the Chinese context, it take on the different meanings and could be understood as a partisan issue and as a political issue. So that's my basic response.
Thank you. Dr. Yeo, can I ask you to just continue on in that same vein and respond to this? In China, is there a robust liberation theology, or what we in the West would recognize as a liberation theology?
Yes, there something resembling liberation theology in the West, but not exactly the same. Especially, you'll find the similar approach more within TSPM system. So the TSPM is an official theology, or it's a dominant theological conversation has to do, is a concern, is a primary concern, is how to adapt it, the evangelical theology of the Chinese church to the new social reality. So the TSPM theology really encourage the believers to be loving and to be kind in the social context, to work out of its self-isolations, and to be more integrated with a society, with a larger society, with the culture. So that's basically kind of an approach of the TSPM theology. But its conclusion is very different from the liberation theology we have in the West. In the West, to my understanding, to my knowledge, the liberation theology in the West turned to be very critical of the social reality. So usually presents as a challenge to the existing social orders and political orders. But in China, the TSPM theology certainly encourage the church and Christians to be more socially and culturally sensitive and conscious. But its eventual conclusion, the final conclusion is this: to stay relevant in the Chinese societies, you have to identify, and really you have to embrace the existing social orders and ideology behind existing social orders. You really have to embrace, to identify yourself with the social and the political establishment. And so that really, leading to the less critical attitude toward society and culture on part of the Chinese Christians and Chinese church.
Dr. Armstrong, can I just say a word about that too?
Yeah.
I found it interesting as you read some of Bishop Ting's writings in his book, for instance, God is Love. Bishop Ting was the head of the Nanjing Seminary for 45 years. And really the head of the Chinese Christian Council for a good number of those decades. He spoke in many ways against some of the aspects of liberation theology, simply because liberation theology at its heart has at its desire to overthrow the powers that be.
Right.
And he, working alongside of the Chinese socialist or Chinese communist government, did not want to see that happen if he was going to keep his job or remain in power in that sense. So while there were certain aspects of liberation theology he embraced, definitely that part of the overthrow of the powers that be was not part of his conversation.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. The Bishop Ting theology and liberation theology certainly, in my opinion, share the large theological framework, or they have the same starting point in the theological discussion. But interestingly, they reached a completely different conclusion. And one is sort of challenging the existing social reality, the social order. Another one is affirming the social orders in China. So it's a very ironic.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch over those years how Bishop Ting's theology kind of adjusted with what was coming from the ruling party at that time and seeking to kind of find an equal place for them to be in harmony with each other. So.
Yes.
What we've seen so far in this class is that there does seem to be something that resembles liberation theology in much of the world. So far we've sampled from South America and Africa. Now we're sampling also from Asian theology. But what that liberation theology looks like by its very nature as a theology that's in direct engagement with the political situation will be very different in each case, no doubt.
Good. That's right.
Thank you. Dr. Weigel, would you like to follow up with any further comments or questions?
Yeah, I would say kind of the other side of the coin of liberation theology is the health and wealth gospel. So you're faced with inequality or you're faced with a difficult economic situation, and you can either try to change the structure or you can try to change yourself. And I think the health and wealth gospel takes that back to the individual and sort of embraces the structure and the authority as it is. It says, I need to renew myself rather than renew society, right? And that's kind of what I've looked at in the Philippines with these health and wealth. The health and wealth gospel is very, very popular right now in the current economy. And I was wondering if that's a trend in China as well.
Yes, definitely. You know, that's certainly one of the danger or the challenge facing the Chinese Protestant communities. The gospel of success or health, wealth gospel, you know, is gaining the ground and getting very popular. You know, and largely speaking, it's a fairly new phenomenon in China. And you don't have too much of that in the evangelical tradition we just talked about. And evangelical tradition you can trace back to 1920s and 30s. It's a fairly new phenomenon since the 1980s as the Chinese economy began to take off. And especially popular among, you know, that kind of gospel, especially popular first among the church in the countryside. You know, it's a slightly different. It's not, interestingly enough, it's not started as a middle class phenomenon, middle class thing. You know, it really started as a lower class movement. Started probably among those poor and peasant and believers. Who have no access to the basic medical care, health care at all. So all they have is a power of God. So what can they do? Yeah, and so that's the only thing they have. Yeah, and that's still very much the case in many rural areas in China today. Yeah, but in the 1990s. And you know, the gospel of success become kind of a popular among the urban churches too, and then it become the middle class phenomenon in some ways. Yeah, but as I said again, one of the major development of the Chinese Christian communities in the 1980s until today is a diversification. Yeah, and you have certainly powerful. A gospel of success and health, wealth gospel movement, and really gaining the ground in China. But on the other hand, you have the more conservative hardline fundamentalist group who really emphasize the value of suffering, and they try their best to keep the memory of the Chinese church, especially it's a suffering memory about suffer, yeah? And so sacrifice for Christ, and that's a kind of the thing, and we really hold on to, yeah. And thirdly, you have the so-called the new evangelical movement in the urban Christian community in China today. Those people certainly they do not like the gospel of success, yeah, and they thought that's unbiblical. But on the other hand, they began to develop this new interest in the political and social issues and movement, and they have a much stronger interest than those hardline and traditional fundamentalist group I just talked about. So, but for this third group and third, I would say the third sections and third schools of theology, and their focus, certainly they are, in terms of their political social stance, and they are turned to be more confrontational, and they're turned to be more challenging to the existing regime and social orders.
Dr. Yeo. And thank you for that question, Dr. Weigel. Dr. Sisk, you've been patient. Thank you for that. Would you like to address any questions directly to Dr. Yeo?
Sure. I'd love to get some more of his input. I read something a number of years ago when I was just starting to look at the Church of China. It said if you understand two theologians there, you'll really understand the Chinese Church. One is Bishop Ting, who was the head of the Chinese Christian Council for so many years, and also Wang Mingdao, who spent 23 years in prison because of his stance against the Freestyle Church. And you brought up something that I think is such a wonderful thing, and maybe you could talk more to the students about it, was he suffered in jail for 23 years, and that really did influence his theology and his writing, especially as evidence in some of the sermons that we see from him. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
You mean Wang Mingdao in particular?
Sure. Yeah, because I think even today he's such an influencer in the thought and mind of the house church in China, the unregistered church in China.
Yeah. Wang Mingdao was one of the most respected evangelists among the Chinese Christians even today. So he was considered one of the top evangelists of the first generation of the 1920s and 1930s. And he was considered one of the founding fathers of Chinese evangelical traditions. And I would say his theological outlook is basically fundamentalistic and very conservative, and to some degree his theology is very Chinese, and with anti-Western overtone. And when he interprets the Bible, he insists that he was not going to use any commentaries. He just basically straight, and go straight to the Bible and read and interpret Bible on yourself, and depending on the guidance of Holy Spirit, leadings of Holy Spirit. So in that way, his theology is truly Chinese. That's why he was still a revered figure, even in the Chinese church today. And also he was revered, and because his suffering and his willingness to pay the price for his own convictions. He didn't want to compromise in any way whatsoever. That's why he ended up in jail, and he never, overall, he never changed his mind. He never regretted. That kind of spirit of suffering, I believe, is one of the most important and valuable heritage our Chinese church have. And right now, today, my concern is that we are facing the danger of losing that. With all the importation of the Western fashionable theological tradition, theological discourse, and terminologies, and with all kinds of church models, ranging from the Christendom church models to we call the consumerism type of church models, and we are kind of many Christian, many church leaders and and churches today in China today, and turn to forget, you know, his theology and what we can learn from his witness and from his experience. You know, if I would say if that become the reality of the church in the future, I would say that's too bad. And you know, and that's really going to that's the only probably few only things the Chinese church can really contribute to the global church. It is the spirit of suffering and lessons of suffering, and you know how to live as a faithful and suffering minority in a largely non-Christian society and environment. And that's probably the most precious lesson the Chinese church can share with the global church. And increasingly, I think the church everywhere found itself in the same situation. You know, we are marginalized, we are minorities. And what do we do?
Dr. Yeo, would anybody like to respond to any part of that conversation? In a moment, if we have time, I'll open it up to students who will address you on whatever questions they may have, but I want to give you all a response to finish your discussion.
I would say something briefly. I think it's very interesting that you brought up the value of suffering and interpreting the Bible yourself, because this is actually exactly what's going on in the Philippines with the Catholic Church and the Catholic charismatics that I've studied, the health and wealth gospel charismatics. And the church has always emphasized suffering and the value of suffering, and the identity as a Catholic has always been an inherited identity, right? Whereas the Catholic charismatics, as well as a lot of the Pentecostal churches, are a choice that people make to leave the traditional Catholic Church, or the mainstream way of being Catholic, and that's a lot of people think of it as a more modern way of being, with the emphasis on my choice for my religion. And then you bring up, you know, in bringing your own interpretation to the Bible. Seems like a very modern notion of theology. So, I mean, maybe a lot of the things you're talking about are really the adaptation to the current social and economic climate, I guess, because I mean, there are a lot of parallels that could be drawn in the way economies have changed all over the world, right? The neoliberal economy is very short-term and very individualistic, right? So I just wanted to point that out, but I would love to hear from the students as well. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Weigel. Okay, great. Do any of you have any questions for our panelists and our speaker? Any questions? All right.
I was wondering if any of you could speak to the of the charismatic movement in the Chinese church, probably specifically within the TSPM.
The charismatic movement has been on the rise since 1980s in the Three Self Church, as well as in the house church. Well, I would say, largely speaking, I don't see any particular theological or ecclesiastical difference between the between the Chinese version of Pentecostalism and global version and non-Chinese version of Pentecostalism. And they share the same conviction, and you know, their worship style are pretty much the same. They have a pretty much the same impact on the Christian life in China, even though some scholar would try to link the even charismatic movement within the Chinese church with folk religious tradition and movement in China. But I don't think all those efforts attempts 100% convincing, and some of them make make more sense than others. But I would say charismatic movement, Pentecostal movement within the Chinese church, even though it's a popular movement, but still I would say it's only one school or one group or one denomination, if you want to use that term. There, and very strong reform traditions, and also popular, especially among the Christian intellectuals. Of course, the reform people do not like the charismatic movement. And I think in terms of the church leadership, house church, and the Three Self-Church leadership, they welcome charismatic movement, and they do not try to do anything to exclude it, the charismatic movement, minimize its influence. But again, on the other hand, they feel uneasy with certain aspect of charismatic movement, so they keep an eye on them, and they make sure that the charismatic movement never become the dominant force or become the harmful force in the Chinese church. So I think it's a complicated story. It's both beneficial to the Chinese church and in many ways and divisive and controversial.
Thank you. We'll take another question here. Paul, go ahead and let us know who you're addressing the question to.
This question is to Dr. Yale. So I have hearing a lot about Chinese Christians being sent out to Middle East and spreading the gospel. Is it how is that true? And also, if then, do you believe that will it impact will it have a huge impact on the future Christianity in the Middle East?
That's a good question, and I would encourage you to read the essays I mentioned at the very beginning of my lecture today. I don't know whether you'll have access to my PowerPoint slide. You'll find it listed on the second one. I think, let me say it and put it simply this way. There have been a lot of talk about how many Chinese missionaries have been sent out, but also there are lots of debate and questions about that. And I would say, generally speaking, if you look at the missionary landscape of a Chinese church, I would say this. Number one, the Chinese church is ready to take on the task of global missions, but have not done much. Number two, the Chinese church have a great potential, and they began to realize that they cannot just care about their own church, their own community anymore. And increasingly, they began to realize that they have a responsibility to share the gospel with the people in other countries, in other cultures. So they began to develop their visions. And so they're talking about sending thousands missionaries to the overseas. But I think it's coming in probably 10 to 15 years. You'll be probably going to encounter increasing number of Chinese missionaries in the field. But that's not reality today. We're still talking about the vision things and still the preparation stage. So we're still talking about the potential here right now. So if anybody say, oh, we already sent over 100,000 Chinese missionaries overseas, and your question is where are they? I never run into them. Where are they?
I do think it's interesting to note that given the suffering that the Chinese church has gone through, I think it does uniquely to be the gospel into some of these more difficult nations where oftentimes Christianity has been persecuted. So I think maybe, you know, we'll see how God has prepared the church to do that in the future. It'll be exciting to see.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sisk, for that reflection. If I can just ask, we have about 5 minutes left. May I ask all of you, you've all got significant experience in different countries in Asia, what we're generally calling Asia here. Can I get you to brainstorm on what are the characteristics of a, quote, Asian theology? Dr. Yeo, you gave us some of the historical background to know that we can expect a lot of energy, a lot of theological movement in specifically the Chinese context. But if I can just get you to brainstorm together as a threesome, what does an Asian theology look like? What are some of those major bullet points?
Should I go first?
Sure.
Yes. I would say, you know, sometimes it's very hard to identify something which is only Asian and you cannot find anywhere else. But let me say this, and I would say if I have to identify a few unique lessons, we can contribute to the global family of global family of Christianity. I would say number one is the lessons of suffering. Number two is a lesson to live as a faithful minority in a very pluralistic, culturally, religiously pluralistic, and socially pluralistic context. Probably those are two features, and we see more in the so-called the Asian Christianity and Asian theology. Thank you.
I'd also say, and some of this comes from kind of Confucius ideas, but that whole respect of elders, respect to authority, it sometimes plays over into how we view the lordship of Christ in our lives. And I, having grown up in Japan and worked a number of years in Japan, I find that even that Bushido, the way of the samurai, has had an impact on Japanese theology and Japanese understanding of the lordship of Christ. And so that's another area I think that moves beyond Japan into China also.
I would say that as an anthropologist, I would just primarily resist answering that question at all, because I think there's so much diversity in Asia. You can find every world religion in Asia and more, all kinds of local religions and so many ancient traditions, plus ancient civilizations and the history of colonialism, which makes it such a diverse region, especially if you go all the way down to Southeast Asia. So I would not be able to answer that question at all. And I wouldn't, I don't know, I guess I just would think that the specificity of the history of the place would be the important question for me.
That further reflections on Asian theology or even its possibility.
I would say if it's possible, it's going to be very difficult, because Asia is such a continent and context with so much cultural, historical, and religious diversity. It's a bit artificial try to construct one single Asian theology. I would say even under the umbrella of Asian theology, it's probably reasonable to have, the Chinese theology, Korean theology, Japanese theology, and Indian theology, and so on and so forth.
What I think I'm hearing here is that although Pan-Asian theology or Pan-Asian cuisine may be a wonderful thing on a Saturday night, Pan-Asian theology is just too broad. Perhaps we should talk to Asia as the largest land mass in the world, perhaps it would be better to speak individually of Christian theologies in specific parts of Asia.
Yes, that's my point. Thank you.
Have you, and we'll dismiss the class in a moment. Well, we are very, very grateful for your time today and for your energetic conversation. Thank you for that. We'd like to thank Dr. Kevin Xiwi Yeo, Associate Professor of World Christianity and Asian Studies at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, Dr. Timothy Sisk, Chair and Professor of World Missions and Evangelism at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, and thank you also Catherine Weigel for joining us, Adjunct Assistant Professor at Northern Illinois University and Sociocultural Anthropologist. Class, would you join me in thanking them for their contributions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
For the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.